Welcome to Jewish by Choice with Eli Deutch at Old City Radio in Jerusalem.
You have to feel I need to start my day with investing in this relationship with Hashem, speaking to Hashem from my heart.
We're going to give our kids to you, and we're going to make raising them about you.
There's an overwhelming feeling of holiness in the Old City that you can't compare it to anywhere else.
Welcome to Jewish by Choice. Today we're going to talk about the concept of freedom, personal freedom versus slavery of self. Typically when people talk about freedom, so if you were to ask your average Joe on the street, what do we mean by freedom? So average Joe is probably going to say something along the lines of freedom is, I'm free to do whatever I feel like doing, whenever I feel like doing it. But is that really true? If we take a look, if we start scratching the surface a little bit, we find that we got to examine that definition. When we think about freedom, right? I'll give you an example. Let's see if that definition is really true. So a friend of my wife, we will call her Rebecca because that is her name. She was but 11 years old when she heard about this cool thing called smoking, and she figured, I've got to give this a try. And so Rebecca, she finds her way to a cigarette and she smokes it. And do you think that she enjoyed it? No, she did not enjoy it. But even at age 11, she had the wisdom and maturity to know that the finer tastes in life need to be acquired over time. And so Rebecca continued to find her way to cigarettes and to sneak cigarettes until fast forward, here we are 30 years later, and Rebecca is a smoker, not just tasting one from time to time. Now, what do you think? Over the last 30 years, has Rebecca attempted to quit from time to time? Sure. You know what they say about smoking. Quitting smoking is easy. Every smoker does it at least once a month. So sure enough, Rebecca has tried many times to quit smoking, but she has been unsuccessful. So do we think when Rebecca today takes a cigarette, would we say that this is an expression of her freedom? Right? I don't think so. Right? I'm sure we can agree that is not an expression of freedom. Sure, she doesn't have anybody from the outside stopping her from doing that, but she's enslaved to the cigarette. She's enslaved to the smoking, right? But she is doing whatever she feels like doing whenever she feels like doing it, right? And so what we see from this is that whatever you feel like doing whenever you feel like doing it, there's an aspect of slavery in that. Right? Let's contrast this with another story. Also a smoking tale. This one a little closer to home. This one's about my grandfather. My grandfather was a little bit older. He was at the ripe old age of 15 or 16 when he began to smoke. And he smoked pretty much all the time. You would see him. It was a whole persona by him. You know, back in those days, they had their smoking jacket. Every picture that was taken, it was with a pipe or with a cigarette or something. And so if you think about it, was my grandfather, was his family happy about the fact that he was smoking? No, right? He grows up, he has a wife, he has kids. And sure enough, of course, they're not happy. But time passes, and then there's an uncle of mine, Uncle Elliot. He also becomes my grandfather's kind of default ally in the family when he picks up smoking as well. He starts to appreciate the taste of a good cigar from time to time. And so he kind of becomes my grandfather's default ally in the family when it comes to smoking. And sure enough, time goes by. My grandfather's actually getting older. His health ain't what it used to be. He's actually starting to smoke a little bit more. And the family's now concerned. They're starting to get concerned. They're starting to get worried. Until one day, there's my grandfather. He's sitting at the table. He's got the newspaper in one hand. He's got the pipe in the other. And in walks Uncle Elliot. Uncle Elliot walks in, sits down right across from my grandfather. And he looks at my grandfather and says, you know, Dad, it's enough already. It's enough. Your health ain't what it used to be. You're smoking more lately. It's enough with the smoking. At that moment, my grandfather looks at my uncle, looks at the pipe, looks at my uncle, puts down the pipe, never picks it up again after 40 years of smoking, quit on the spot. True story. But here's my question for you. 90 seconds later, when my grandfather had the feeling and the desire to smoke, and he didn't, would we say that that is an expression of his freedom? Yeah, I think for sure we would, right? But he's not doing whatever he feels like doing whenever he feels like doing it, right? And so we see from this that really what we mean by freedom is not just I'm free to do whatever I feel like doing whenever I feel like doing it, right? That's good that we're not imposed upon by an outside force. But if that's going on within me, there's an aspect of slavery in that. Real freedom is going to be the ability to extract myself, to free myself from myself in order to make a conscious decision, right? Think about it. Whatever you feel like doing, whenever you feel like doing it, where is the assertion of the I? Where is the assertion of the self? Where is making a higher choice in all of that? Where is conscious? Where is being conscious, getting outside of myself, of my pulls, of things that are pulling me one way or another, right? Where is the inner freedom in all of that, right? You see a similar idea in the sources in Judaism, in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers. It says, Ezehu Gibor, who is a person who is strong, Hakovesh et Yitzro, the one who conquers their inclination. The one who has a certain personal mastery over themselves, that is the one who we consider strong. And if you think about it in your own life, you acknowledge that, right? In your own life, if you have something going on, if you're something you're not sure about, if you're in a dilemma, who do you seek out for advice, for counsel? Someone who's owned by their emotions, someone who's pulled by whatever they're feeling whenever they're feeling it, or someone who you recognize has managed to extract themselves from the typical pulls that most people have in their life, their typical emotions that most people have in their life, and they seem to have mastered themselves, right? And that gives you the feeling that they've mastered life, right? And think about it. We all have people in our lives who, they react to things, and they react in a certain way, perhaps in an explosive way, and they're even kind of proud of it. They're like, listen, this is how I react. This is how I react because this is how I am. This is just who I am, right? And so sometimes you listen to this, you deal with it. Maybe you have to tolerate it. But is that something you respect, or is there something within you that feels like, this person's kind of holding on the level of a 5-year-old, right? At least when they're in that emotional state, right? And so we all really know, and we all really intuit within ourselves that real freedom means to be able to have a certain level of self-mastery, to be able to free yourself from yourself, right? And that's the person who we respect. That's the person we look to when we're going through a struggle, right? And the truth is that this is how we begin a journey in spirituality as well, right? Because a lot of times when people think about spirituality, especially in the West, when we think about spirituality or the spiritual person, our vision goes to a place. We imagine or envision someone, like maybe someone at the top of a mountain. Maybe they have like long curly hair, and maybe they have maybe imagine a young lady with a flowy skirt, and she's at the top of the mountain. The wind's blowing, and it feels like, wow, they're just going to be taken off into a cloud, right? Wow, so spiritual, right? But interestingly enough, in Judaism, we have one of the words for God, right, is Hatzor, the rock, meaning to say that spirituality really begins at the place of making a conscious decision, being able to gain some clarity and be sturdy and be clear on who we are and what we're about and what's important. And no matter where the winds blow, it's not going to pull us astray. It's not going to pull us off of our direction, of our clarity, of who we want to be and what we want to do. We're able to go outside of those winds of change to be able to rise above them. And we see that this is the beginning of this concept of personal freedom, is at the beginning of the spiritual journey, according to Judaism. We see at the beginning of the Jewish family as well as the beginning of the Jewish nation. The beginning of the Jewish family begins with Abraham, right? Father of the Jewish people. What is the first thing that we see that God says to Abe in the Torah? Lech lecha me'artzecha me'moladetecha me'beit avicha. Right? God says to Abe, listen, Lech lecha, go to you. That if you want to go to you, if you want to go to the reality of who you are, if you want to go to your personal potential, if you want to be that spiritual journeyer, that spiritual searcher, that spiritual seeker, if you want to go to your personal potential, Lech lecha, if you want to go to who you really are and really, really could be, God says, I have a 3-point plan prerequisite in order to get there. You have to leave me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha u'mibeit avicha. You have to leave from your land, from your birthplace, and from your parents' house. Like and subscribe for more inspirational content. Now, can you hear the idea that this is not just talking about physical location, right? Because if it was just talking about physical location, God could have just said, leave your land, and that would include the other ones, and we'd be good to go. right? But, and truth is also, anytime the Torah is talking, it's giving us a message for our lives as well, right? So hear the idea that this is not just talking about physical location. Can you hear the idea that when God says to leave your land, it's not just talking about a physical land, but it's talking about the culture of your land, the atmosphere of your land, the way society has been running and working in your land. What are their moods? What is their moral code or lack thereof, right? What are they looking at as true and false? What are they looking at as good and evil, right? To be able to extract yourself, if you want to go on a spiritual search, if you want to go on a personal journey, if you want to go search for truth, stage number one, prerequisite is we need to leave from our land. We need to leave from those influences, right? And that culture. All right. Number two, to leave from your birthplace. So we all have a certain quote unquote place we're born in. We all have a certain genetic predispositions, right? Not genetic predeterminations, genetic predispositions. We're predisposed, right? Whether it be brain chemical balances or imbalances, whatever it might be, we have certain genes that we might be more prone to a certain way of feeling or responding. Some people might be a little bit more prone to anger and explosiveness. Other people might be more prone to a calm demeanor, perhaps based on their genetics. And so if we want to be able to really go on a journey, if we want to be able to really free ourselves and become free people, that means being able to pull ourselves out of that nature and out of that feeling that, yes, we will have a certain nature to go in one direction or another. But to be able to see ourselves heading in that direction, say, hold on a second, maybe this isn't the way to go. To be able to, even though it feels right or it feels natural, to be able to extract ourselves from that and choose in another direction, right? That would be real freedom, wouldn't it? Right? And number three, to leave from our parents' house, that we all have certain ways of responding emotionally, especially in relationship, based on how we were raised, based on the influences that we saw in our home, right? Not what they preached, but what they practiced, right? That becomes our first nature, right? What we witnessed becomes what our original sense of normal and what is natural and obvious. And so, one time I saw, actually, there was a clip going around on social media, and in this clip on social media, it was a clip from one of these nightly shows that are on in the USA. And the host gets up and he says to his audience, listen, tomorrow night is Halloween. And here's what I want you to do, he says to his audience. When your kids come home after trick-or-treating and they go to sleep, afterwards you go ahead and take their candy, steal their candy, hide it somewhere else. And then the following morning when they come looking for their candy and they don't find it and they ask you where it is, tell them you ate it, and then record their response and send it to us. And so, of course, if the man on the television says to do something, X percentage of people are going to follow through. And sure enough, a couple of days later, this host comes back on, and he comes on with a whole assortment of clips that were sent to him from these parents that went ahead and did this little exercise. And he shows it to his audience, and pretty much all the kids cry. But then there's one kid who's throwing things across the room, another kid who's banging his fist in the table, another one knocking his head against the wall. And then there was this other young lady, this other girl, who actually sat down across from her mother and starts talking about her feelings. But Mom, wouldn't you do that? Why did you do that? Didn't you know how it would make me feel? And so, of course, most of the audience is cracking up at that moment. But there I am watching the clip, and I'm just thinking like, let's take a step back and scratch the surface a little bit and say, hold on a second. Why is it that this person's throwing something across the room, this one's knocking his head against the wall, and this one's sitting down and talking about her feelings? Can you hear the idea that like 90% chance, right? 90% of the time, and you know what they say, 80% of statistics are made up. We'll let that go. 90% of the time, can you hear the idea that this person, this girl is, or really all of these parents, all of the kids are doing the kid version of what they see their parents do when their parents experience something where they feel like they've been messed over, right? And so much of what is put in, so much of how we are acting, so much of what we call us is actually based on what has been put into us by our experiences, right? As well as our genetics, but especially here in this case, so much is put into us by especially our reactions, our gut reactions, what we think is us, and what we think about how we respond and how we identify with that response that we often give that comes automatically and naturally. So much of that was actually put into us based on how our caretakers reacted in their own lives that we witnessed. And so we see that freedom begins by leaving our quote unquote land, birthplace, and parents' house. And we see a similar thing by the beginning of the Jewish nation, that the Jewish people, when they were a family, they head into Egypt. By the time they're leaving Egypt, they're considered to be a nation. And so what do we see about that story about the Jewish people leaving Egypt? Let's talk about it for a second. And by the way, before we jump into the story about leaving Egypt, let's talk about what we mean by the Torah for a second. Right? When the Torah tells us these stories, how are we supposed to understand them? A lot of people think that the Torah tells us stories and it's for the purpose of that we should know Jewish history. And yeah, maybe that's true, and it's definitely an added bonus, but that's not really the reason why the story made the cut into the good book, right? The Torah, what do we mean by Torah, right? Torah is from the word mora, and mora is teacher, right? Really from the word hora'ah, right? Torah is teachings. Teachings for what? Teachings for life. And so let's understand that anything we see in the Torah, not just the statutes, not just the laws, not just those things, not just the commandments, but really also all the stories are to give us messages, teachings for us, for our own lives. That's why they made the cut into the book. And any history we get from it, that's awesome, but it's a bonus. And so when we see the story about the Jewish people leaving Egypt, what can we learn from it, right? It's definitely a big theme. And so one thing we can do is we take a look at, hold on, what is Egypt, right? What is Egypt? Well, how do you say it in Hebrew? Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is from the Hebrew word meitzarim, which means boundaries, borders, constrictions, that which is holding us back. And so that means to say that when the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt, it wasn't just a physical slavery. It was a slavery on all levels: physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. And then when the Jewish people, they bust out of Egypt, and then where did they go? So a lot of people answer, well, they went to the land of Israel. Well, yeah, okay, that's the SparkNotes version. But first they go to the desert, right? And what's in the desert? Nothing. This is exactly the point. We all have our Egypt situations. We all have our own Mitzrayims. We all have our own boundaries, borders, constrictions, that which is holding us back, whether they be physical limitations or emotional situations we've been set up with based on our upbringing, a way we've been given to think, whether that be philosophically about the world or also about ourselves. We heard messages, and then our inner voice perpetuated them over and over and over again. We all have these different confinements, these different Mitzrayims in our lives. And what Judaism is saying is, if you want to go on that spiritual journey, prerequisite, you got to break out of that Mitzrayim. And when we break out of that Mitzrayim, where do we go? We go to our personal place of desert. And like we said, what's in the desert? Nothing. And that's exactly the point. We go to our personal place of nothingness, our personal place of openness, of open-mindedness, right? Not the open-mindedness of your university campus where if you say something against what they have to say, they will destroy you. Right? What we're talking about is real open-mindedness, real openness, the ability to truly get outside of the way of thinking that I've been given and to truly contemplate something different. And it's specifically there that the Torah is given, because only to the extent that we're open to receive a new piece of information, it's only to that extent can we truly receive it. If we're still holding on to our preconceived notions, so then when we get that new piece of information, we start slicing and dicing it up, editing it in order to fit into our preconceived notions, and we don't ever get to receive really what that piece of information is at its core and at its essence. And so this is the necessary step by which we begin our spiritual journey, right, is by that place of personal freedom. And so I bless us to be able to master ourselves and open up to truly getting outside of ourselves and getting outside of the different things that the culture has given us and the different ways we were raised that perhaps sent us in certain modes of thinking, to be able to extract ourselves from a lot of that stuff and say, okay, I'm ready to go on a personal journey. Thank you for listening to Jewish by Choice. For more content just like this, check out EliTheJew.com.